The Canadian men have one more game to go in the group stage. It's against Morocco. You can argue that it does mean something. It does mean something for Morocco. There is still a battle to move on to the next round in that group. You could also argue that it means something for the Canadians to get their first result. They would preferably love their first win at a World Cup and not have that hang over their heads as a storyline into 2026. But we know they're eliminated. At the end of the day, KJ, they're gone. And there are a lot of people, and rightfully so, feel proud of what this team has accomplished. But if you're going to call yourself a footballing nation, I could be in the minority here. That also means you have to start asking the tough questions, because when you're a footballing nation, you have hope, you have expectations. So the team is gone. They're gone after 2 games. In particular, I want to talk about the midfield. And do you think that that is a concern moving forward for this team, KJ? Because having to keep Atiba in because Eustachio came out when there were other midfielders on the bench, does that raise questions about depth at all?
Well, I mean, first of all, we're talking about midfield because it's the most important position. Right, Jordan? Yeah, of course it is. Jordan's going to agree with me. But, you know, you don't win games unless you don't win games very often if you don't win midfields. So it's absolutely crucial. And that's why Stefan Eustachio is arguably one of the most important players in Canadian soccer history when it comes to this team, because he is so young and because his profile of as a player makes him so unique. So look, as I said yesterday, the midfield collapsed at the wrong time. Eustachio got hurt. Hutchinson couldn't go again because of how little fitness he'd had. You know, and in the end, I think, as I alluded to, John Herdman didn't trust certain players to play in that big moment. You know, and maybe that is respecting Croatia, when many people have accused the national team that they haven't respected them. Maybe he respected them by thinking he only had a certain amount of players that could play in that position. So it's a difficult one. I mean, Kone got his chance, Osorio got his chance as well. You know, the other thing to say here is that games come thick and fast here in Qatar. You have one less day off in between matches than you've had in the past World Cup. And there's an average amount, I just watched another team today in Korea, South Korea, there's an average amount of changes of 4 changes per team from game 1 to game 2. Canada decided not to make that many changes, and I think it showed. Ultimately, you can take that 2 different ways. One, you can play Monday morning quarterback and have a go at the coach because he didn't do it. Or 2, you can just say it's just down to the lack of top quality players that they trust at that level, right? So either way, that's probably another reason why it cost them in the end. You know, argue whether they should have played 4-4-2 is another thing. But Ollie, I think it's clear that at the highest level, they don't have too many midfielders right now that he can rely on to play in those big games.
No, that's the big kind of takeaway for me, and the conclusion I think that's hard to avoid based on the decisions that John Herdman made was that he looked behind him on that bench in the Croatia game, and there wasn't enough guys, certainly in central midfields, that he felt he could trust in that game against that kind of quality. And I think we've seen that. Like, we can talk about the players. I don't think it takes a genius to work out who those players are. Liam Fraser, I think, has kind of fallen off the radar of the national team a little bit since his move to Belgium. We know he's trying to rebuild his club career there, but he's not playing at the highest level. Marc-Anthony Kaye was fantastic in 2021. 2022 hasn't been the same, and we've seen his minutes with the national team decrease as a result. Sam Piette was probably the one we looked at and expected to play at this tournament. Obviously, much more than he has, which is not at all. But I think it was probably those Uruguay and Japan friendlies where I don't think Piette necessarily had 2 of his best games that called that into question a little bit in terms of his ability, particularly in possession, to cope with this level. So all of a sudden you're left with, a trio of midfielders, I think, that Herdman has judged to be usable in this tournament, where Eustachio has played a ton of games for Porto and gets injured right before the tournament. Hutchinson has played 1 game for Besiktas and isn't fully fit. And then you have Ismail Kone, who this time last year wasn't a professional footballer. So that I think is going to be a big question coming out of this tournament. And it's a bigger question probably than we have time to get into in terms of development in this country and how we produce more midfield players going forwards here, leading into 2026 and beyond. But it's got to be a massive priority, because one of those 3 guys I just named is probably going to play his last game for Canada this week. So now all of a sudden you're down another one and down more depth in that area. So it's a big, big question, I think, when you talk about player development in this country going forwards.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add one thing before Jordan says. Go ahead. I just wanted to say one thing.
No, you go.
The other thing I would say too is if this becomes a big problem going down the line, I would not rule out Alistair Johnson playing central midfield for Canada. I'm telling you, he's played there before. He's played there before. He's one of the most intelligent players to play for Canada in a long time. It's nothing new to him. And we've seen the evolution of the fullback coming into central positions tactically in and out of possession anyway. You know, Philip Lahm's done it. I mean, Alistair Johnston's no Philip Lahm, but there are skill sets to do that. So maybe that's something in the future that they can seriously think about. They have right backs like Richie Larea, maybe Zach Rogiard, and others that can play in those positions. You know, again, it's just options going forward that I think they can think about. Jordan.
KJ, you never told me that you're a manager. You never told me you've been playing Football Manager on the side. KJ, keeping secrets. I would add to Alistair Johnston as well, KJ, that he has an engine, which is obviously crucial for playing in the engine room. Guy never stops running, never looks like he's out of energy. He's always giving. So yeah, that's a great shout. The only thing I'll add to what the gentleman said was getting the balance right in the midfield is probably one of the hardest things a manager has to do. I would say what Ollie was going through all the players we have right now with Canada's squad, there are a lot of players that are similar. I think the difference is in quality, but getting the balance right of everyone talks about a 6 and their role, an 8, his role, and a 10 and what they do. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to balance. When you looked at the bench for Canada, no disrespect to guys, but to come on, it wasn't going to add to the game. It was going to disrupt the balance. You're either, if you had to keep Atiba on, playing a deep lying midfielder, the guys who were coming out the bench, like a Piet, Mark Anthony Kay, they weren't guys really to go forward or maybe change the game. The one move that Herdman could make was playing Oso, who's a bit tactically sound, can make runs forward, and is like an 8/10. So I think he did the best with what he had.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess that's the big question. Did the best with what he had. So now moving forward, how do you make sure what you have is who you can also trust? It's not just your starting 11, but when games get tough, who can you bring in? So I feel like that's a question mark as well moving forward, because as you also alluded to, Ollie, we know Atiba's not going to be around for 2026. Right. KJ, we know Jonathan David can score goals. There's no denying that. The guy's great in Ligue 1. There's talk of him making a move to a higher league. There's been all kinds of rumors floating around about teams in the English Premier League interested in him. But he was quiet at this World Cup. Why do you think that is?
I don't know if he was quiet at the World Cup. I mean, I think he played really well against Belgium, guys. I just think he didn't get his chances. It didn't take his chances enough. He was heavily involved. I thought his movement was exceptional. Caused a lot of problems with the press. He makes intelligent runs. So, you know, I thought he did fine. Look, the game against Croatia was just not built for Jonathan David. Ultimately, Canada couldn't keep the ball. And then Jonathan David is playing in a central area where he's required for service, and the service just didn't come. It wasn't like he's playing in a wide area where suddenly he can make those runs and get on the ball. Jonathan Osorio got on the ball more than David did, I think, and he played less, half a game. So I think that just goes to show you that he's struggling in that system at that moment. But I'm genuinely not concerned about him at all. Ollie, World Cups have swallowed up bigger names than playing number 9s than Jonathan David. It's just a major tournament, right? That's what happens sometimes.
Yeah, I don't think anyone needs to be concerned about Jonathan David individually as a player. What I would say is that I think sometimes, and I don't think the World Cup has been the first time with him, it does say something bigger, I think, about how this Team Canada plays and maybe some of their limitations as a team, is that for me, this is still a team that's a team of moments. And we saw that through qualifying, where they can produce something out of nothing in transition, go from back to front in, under 5 seconds and score a spectacular goal. We saw Davies do that. We saw David do that. We saw a lot of examples of that in qualifying. And I think we saw it in the goal they scored against Croatia as well, very quickly back to front. What they don't do is they don't really control games for long periods. They don't really sit in the opposition half for long periods, impose themselves on teams for long periods. And that is something I think that's going to have to be an evolution of this team going into 2026. And that is when you're going to see the consistent threat of Jonathan David's, being involved in the game, getting a lot of touches, as opposed to just producing those moments every now and then, because that's the kind of service he's getting. And really, that's all you can expect in that kind of team.
Well, let me jump back to you, KJ, and then Jordan, I'd love for you to chime. Saying that then, when we are looking at this game against Croatia, because I think we can all agree how they played against Belgium was exceptional. the world was walking away saying Canada should have gotten something from that game. It just wasn't meant to be. So we're really talking about this Croatia game where they desperately needed a draw in order to stay alive because of what happened between Morocco and Belgium and Morocco beating Belgium. And they didn't get it. Was this just, I mean, is it simple, KJ, to just say, listen, you're taking on Croatia. Understand who you're taking on. They were going to win this game anyway. Or are you going to be a little bit more critical and say, tactically, this should have been done?
Yeah, I think if we want to become that top nation, I think we should be allowed to dissect it. No, like we should be allowed to do that. Like I understand there are moments, and there's there are other members of the media coming up to me today, quite often saying, hold your head up high, guys. You did well. Canada should be proud of the way you played. It's your first World Cup. You got your first goal. You went toe-to-toe with the semi-finalists. All of that. I think they're allowed to say that. They are perceiving our country differently than the four of us and people watching the show right now. Because if you're watching this show and you're with us, you're a hardcore fan of the sport in this country. And so I think we're allowed to have different conversations than they are. And I think that's now part of the next evolution of this team, right? That's what's happening everywhere else. That's what's happening in Brazil right now. They're on a 4-hour live post-game show debating whether they should play another midfielder. England's going crazy because they drew 0-0 against the US and the whole thing's falling down. So this is culture. This is football culture, right? This is what is going on. This is what it's about. So if I'm never going to say, no, we shouldn't talk more about it. Let's get on board, everybody. If you want to talk to me about should they play an extra midfielder against Croatia, I'm all for it. Let's have that debate. Let's talk about it. Systems and changes and tactics and players and staff within this country and within the CSA are going to have to get used to that. And they're going to have to get thicker skin because that's part of becoming a soccer culture as well. And not everybody's right, but it's just about having that conversation and more people to go, this is what World Cups do, Ollie. This is what World Cups do. They bring people to the table to talk about this thing. This is an opportunity to have those conversations, right, wrong, or indifferent.
Of course, yeah. I think that's important, and I think that is growing in this country. And at the same time, I totally agree with what KJ says, but I will say at the same time, it's important for us to put it into context as well, right? That this was a team that has basically been pieced together over the last 2 years into a World Cup. And so it's not surprising that there's limitations there. It's not surprising that there's still a lot of areas for growth for this team. And it doesn't negate the job they've done just to get to this point. But, there's plenty of things you can look into that game and pick out tactically that I'm sure if they had it again, they might do it a little bit differently.
Jordan, as a player, I'm wondering how you're feeling. Because I do also feel that there's like a line. There's a line that can very easily be blurred where, I mean, yes, as fans and as a nation, you're very proud of what they've accomplished. But sometimes I feel like if you're a competitive person and people keep going, they're there, you did your best, it can also easily become patronizing. Like, how are you feeling right now if, put yourself in their shoes in that room?
Well, you teased me yesterday because my energy levels are low and I was sad. Well,
you were.
I was sad, genuinely like sad. Friends on the team, whatever, just how well they've played. But I think that you embrace criticism. I think that's just a part of playing the sport, especially at a high level. These guys at a World Cup, people are saying now it should fire something within their soul. Like they should feel like, man, we were that close to beating Belgium. If we tweaked a little bit against Croatia, it could have been a different outcome. To get a tip of it, I look at it, the analogy I look at is if you're a boxer, you want to box against the guy that can knock you out. Like, obviously, no one wants to get knocked out, but you want to box against the best. That's the way you
challenge yourself.
Like, yeah. I'm glad you want to challenge yourself. You want to be in the ring with the best. Canada faced Belgium. It could have taken it to them. And Croatia, it was a great lesson. I feel like that's a match to watch back and really dissect every 5 minutes and look at what could be different. But it's not patronizing. It's just taking it in for the moment and for what it is, that Canada's not there yet. But I guarantee you they will get there.
All right. Something else that was kind of created a little bit of a storyline there, KJ, and I know you were talking a bit about it on Twitter as well, as there were comments made about Alphonso Davies, who is the face of the team, who is the superstar here, not speaking to, non-rights holders, international media. And, there's been other players who have been doing just that. Why do you think it's important for, players to kind of go above and beyond with media commitments at these types of events? Like we're talking the World Cup.
Well, that's the story, I think, that it's the World Cup. I'm not going to sit here and say we need you to do all these interviews all of the time. I think if I was advising them on him, I would just say that these conversations need to happen before things happen. In other words, you need to be anticipating things if things happen. So, for me, I would have hoped the conversation internally would have happened to say, the moment we score our goal, that player, guys, that's the moment that you're going to have to go in front of the media and you're going to do everything you could possibly have to do that night. Whether we win 1-0 or get smashed 8-1, you are the story that day, and we're going to put you there and you're going to have to do everything. So that, for me, I don't think that clearly has happened. I don't know, but that should be happening beforehand. That's what that you have to, it's part of leadership. You have to anticipate things before they happen. And then they're aware of it. So I'm not solely blaming Alfonso. But the reason why I think it's a big deal is because, first of all, I was there, and there was a lot of people questioning it. And it's not just Canadian media. I'll tell you who was there: Italians, Polish, American, French, English, Scots. I can go on and on. All from major tabloids, newspapers, and all wanting to get a quote from Germans, get a quote from Alfonso Davies. They weren't able to get it because he did the flash interviews. It's one thing to do the flash interviews. You are contractually obligated to do that, right? But I think it's just very important to tell those stories in those moments. And I thought it was a real missed opportunity for our game to not hear from him. And ultimately, again, he's a young man, and it's not solely his fault. But I think, guys, he's the face of our team now at 22. He's the future captain of Canada. And it cannot always just be Stephen Vittoria, Richie Larea, Alistair Johnston, and the same people coming out to talk all the time. Because you know what? That infuriates media a few times. Eventually, in my experience, you know who else that infuriates? The players. Yeah. They eventually say, I need you to do this as well. And so I just think it was a learning moment, and I'm not blaming him, but I think there's a lot to take there from a lot of people, Ollie.
Yeah, for sure. And look, it's a battle that the journalists are never going to win in the court of public opinion, because journalists aren't very popular and professional footballers are very popular, right? So there's naturally an inclination to side with Alfonso. And I also sympathize with the fact that Alfonso does do a lot, right? From all the broadcast interviews that he has to do to, the partnerships that he's involved in and all the public appearances of any capacity that he has to make. It's a lot of things to do for someone who I don't think necessarily relishes it in my experience with Alfonso in terms of being stood in front of cameras and doing those things. So I get that, and I sympathize with him on that front. I would say, though, and again, this is probably more for the people around him than for Alfonso himself, not to be too kind of over the top or grandiose about it, but he's just scored the first goal at a Men's World Cup in Canadian history. Like it's a moment in history for the sport in this country, right? You want to hear in that moment, what does he think? What's his reaction? What's he feeling? And I think it's a real shame that the traveling journalists who are there to document that and tell that story are not able to do so in something that would just take a few minutes. So that I think is a little bit of a shame and a little bit of a disappointment. But again, hopefully it's one of the many lessons we learn coming out of this World Cup.
It is a shame, Ali. I think it's your obligation as a player. Now, Alfonso Davies, a credible story that he has. Being 22, you think, man, I just want to play. I want to score a goal for my country. I want to score a winning goal. Like, these are things, like, as a player you think about. But you still have an obligation to your country to bridge the gap. So, for me, he just has to it's tough because you have to bite the bullet. Like, now that you're a superstar, and now that you're in that stratosphere, and now that you're viewed as such, you have to be called on. It might not be your forte, talking in front of people about how you feel or about losses. It's not great, but understanding that you are the face of Canada, these are things that need to be addressed. You have to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, listen, it's a battle as old as time between media and the athletes, that's for sure. But it's also part of our industry. Like, that kind of irks me a little bit if I can get something off my chest and he doesn't have to talk, she doesn't have to talk. Well, no, like, it actually is how the industry works. Like, we write about it, we broadcast it, we share their stories. That is literally how it works. And then you talk to them to make sure you get their side of the story as well, or any quotes from them. That is literally how the industry works.